Finally, we come to the question of what is the future of international law? Is international law dying? Again, if you would read the web or read articles, news articles, read the newspapers, you may come to this opinion that international law, at least as we've known it since the end of World War II, is dying. Maybe it's not going to be relevant anymore. Maybe in the 21st century, international law won't be what we thought it was in the 20th century. Why is this? Well, we know that the current world order is in flux. We're not sure what is the current world economic order, what's the dominant political order, what's the future of the world, the current world order in flux. And many have questioned whether international law is even relevant. Is it still relevant? And I think today in our political administration, there's a strong belief that international law should only apply if it is to our benefit, to the benefit of the United States. If the law doesn't benefit the United States, then it's not a binding international law. So many have questioned this idea of should we be bound by a law that doesn't benefit us directly? Has international law failed to pay the dividends that we expect? We talked about the belief in the United States after 9/11 that international law failed. The United States suffered an attack on its domestic soil, 3,000 plus people killed, untold injured, huge property damage. Oh, international law didn't help with that at all. We are seeing the same situation now being applied to international trade. That international trade has benefited some countries, like China, but it has harmed the United States. So even though international law seems to be working very well for other countries, well, perhaps it has failed to pay the dividends that here in the United States we expected to get from international trade law. So is international law dying, or, as we'll talk about, is it actually getting stronger? So in this lecture, we're going to examine the status, really the future of international law. And we start with that question, is international law dying? Well, why do we say that? Well, first of all, we could argue that the structures on which it is based are dying. Now, we're going to talk a lot about Western legal traditions in the next lecture, but essentially these are the legal traditions that came out of Western Europe and the United States. Western legal traditions, the civil law and the common law traditions. Well, there's a lot more to the world than Western Europe and the United States. And so the idea that these traditions that we have should apply to the whole world, well, many would call that into question. So Western legal traditions may not support international law in the future. We know that the state, the importance of the state is declining. We talked about that in our lecture on states and statehood. The primacy of the state is declining. 9/11, that the attack by Al-Qaeda was carried out by a non-state actor. And I think that fed a lot of the fervor that led to the Second Persian Gulf War, the war in Iraq, was, look, we've been attacked, but who is it that we go after? Who do we respond to? There's no country out there. Yes, we invaded Afghanistan, but that wasn't sufficient. We needed a state. We needed a state to attack, a fully functioning state. And yet, the state was not what it was supposed to be. Most of the world's terror today is not state-sponsored. It involves non-state actors. And certainly we've seen challenges to core democratic beliefs. The idea, I would say, in the 1990s is that after the end of the Cold War, the world was on a path to democratic control, to democratic philosophies being prevalent throughout the world, that this is the natural course of history. And the idea behind, say, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the invasion of Libya in 2011 were both based on this notion that democracy is going to win, so maybe we just need to help it a little. Let's remove the non-democratic leader, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi. Let's remove them and allow democracy to flourish. But of course, we have removed those non-democratic leaders, but they have oftentimes not been replaced by democratic structures. So the idea that democracy is going to win because it's going to win, and that's the natural course of the world, that's what the course that we're on, well, maybe that's not true. And so perhaps international law, which relies on those democratic principles, is no longer relevant. However, I think you could make the argument that international law is actually getting stronger. Numerous signs indicate that international law is stronger than ever. Let's look at Western Europe. Western Europe, which spent most of the 20th century beating itself up, incurring huge losses in life, incurring untold billions of dollars in property damages, that in the 21st century, that's gone by the wayside. In fact, since World War II, we have seen a long era of peace and prosperity in Western Europe. And following the demise of the Soviet Union, we saw many Eastern European countries that looked to the West for trading partners and for political allies, and created the European Union. The European Union, which has 28 countries at this time. And the neat part about the European Union is these 28 countries are sharing a common body of law. So this would have been unthinkable 30 years ago, 40 years ago, but now it seems normal that the European Union gets to make regulations that affect its member states. In fact, we have 19 of the countries share the same currency, the euro. And that's really wild when you think about it. The level of international cooperation that's necessary for countries to share a currency is extreme. And that sharing could not occur without a strong international legal system. We know that economic cooperation, even while controversial, is still high. Since the 1980s, countries have cooperated in terms of trade in extremes that have never been seen before. This is why when the United States recreated the idea of tariffs and made tariffs an instrument of public policy, that seemed so strange to a lot of people, because tariffs, which are artificial barriers to economic cooperation, seemed like a relic of the past. It seems like something that's very 19th century to it, or early 20th century. So economic cooperation, although the United States has decided it's not going to cooperate as much as it used to, for the rest of the world, it's at an all-time high. The World Trade Organization, that group of member countries that have agreed on rules involving trade, is stronger than it's ever been. We know global poverty levels are an all-time low, and the reason I relate this to international law is what has made them so low. This is an all-time low. If you look at trends over the last 20 years, global poverty has shrunk. We have lifted numerous countries out of poverty levels. We've created a thriving middle class in China and in other countries and throughout the world, Brazil, Russia. These countries are less poor than they were before. Now, why is that? Well, that's because we have allowed commerce to flow across international borders. And therefore, where there is a need for a good, that good doesn't have to be satisfied only by the population of that state, but could be satisfied by the population of another state. So you have countries like China and Vietnam and Thailand that have become manufacturing powerhouses because that's what they're good at. They make goods at a price that people can afford to buy and want to buy. And all of that, as we will discuss, is made possible by the legal framework of international law. We can also note that international law is flexible. It's able to grow and adapt. When we talk about customary international law, yes, many of those customs are based on Western traditions, but nothing in the definition says they have to be. That in fact, customary international law can refer to any practice as long as it's general practice and it's accepted as law. So the Western legal traditions are not necessary to ensure the future of international law. Treaties can be executed, written, amended, abrogated. Treaties are very flexible documents as well. So if a treaty is not working, then we can go back and renegotiate that treaty and start over, as long as the parties follow the procedures set out in the treaty. And finally, the nation state. The nation state is still the primary means of governance. It is the principal way in which countries interact with one another, in which societies interact with one another. The nation state is not going away. It's not going to die. 100 years from now, there will still be countries, and that's the future. That's the future. So in conclusion, what do we know? Some elements suggest international law is dying. Other elements suggest that it's getting stronger. And ultimately, the future of international law is in your hands. You can shape the future of international law. And that's it. Thanks.